Tension between Washington, D.C. and Tehran is not new. It is indeed exactly as old as the Islamic Republic of Iran. The year that the Iranian Revolution installed Ayatollah Khomeini, 1979, was the same year that Iranian students, egged on by Khomeini, seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and made hostages of American diplomats, holding 53 of them for 444 days. America's humiliation was compounded by the failure of a rescue operation in April 1980, which left 8 American soldiers dead. Since when, relations have rarely looked like improving. Iran has continued to address the United States as the Great Satan. US President George W. Bush included Iran in his axis of evil. Notable flare-ups between the two countries have included, but very much not been limited to, the demolition of a pair of Iranian oil platforms by the US Navy in 1987 after Iran struck an American flag tanker off Kuwait, the accidental shooting down of an Iranian airliner by a US Navy cruiser in 1988, the United States assassination of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps General Qasem Soleimani in a Baghdad drone strike in 2020. And last June, American B-2 bombers and at least one US Navy submarine joined Israeli aircraft in strikes on targets related to Iran's ambiguous nuclear program. In Iran in recent weeks, and not for the first time, the regime has been confronted with widespread public expressions of discontent, occasioned this time by a careening economic crisis, and has responded with dreadful violence. Nobody really knows how many have died. Few doubt that the toll runs into the many thousands. Last month, US President Donald Trump promised the protesters via a social media post that help was on the way. As of this broadcast, it has not been forthcoming. A conspicuous deployment of US military assets in the vicinity is continuing, but indirect talks between the US and Iran have resumed in Muscat. Could the United States strike a decisive blow against the Iranian regime? What would happen if it did? And what options for survival do the Ayatollahs and the IRGC still have? This is the Foreign Desk.
The trouble that the regime has is that it needs to reform to survive. But actually, the only sort of reform that is going to make it viable is things that ensure that it will be finished.
There is a sense that now it's time for Iran to pay after so many decades of destruction across the region.
The regime is at its weakest point since it came to power in 1979.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Our first guest is Ali Ansari, Professor of Modern History and Director of the Institute for Iranian Studies at St Andrews University. Ali, first of all, it is very difficult, obviously, for independent reporters to actually conduct any journalism in Iran. Do we actually know anything for certain about the scale of the upheaval in the last few weeks?
I think it is very difficult to assess because of the absence of people to fact check on the ground. But we are getting a lot of information out, largely through, obviously, people on the ground who are reporting through the amount of casualties. And obviously, there's been a lot of videos and filming of what's gone on. So at the moment, the more conservative estimate, so the government itself has admitted to this figure of 3,117, which it claims, of course, is largely protesters shooting on themselves or something. You know, it's basically terrorists within the protesters. This figure of 3,117 seems to be a recycled figure. So they use this figure quite regularly when they're claiming deaths from various forms. It is far larger in itself to the figures that have been attested on previous rounds. In 2019, we had about 1,500 was the high-end estimate, actually, of what was going on. But if the government itself is admitting to that figure, then the conservative estimate at the moment that we have 6,600 deaths, plus another 17,000 that are being investigated. I think it's probably safe to assume at the moment, although, you know, these things will need to be finalized, that we're heading towards upwards of 12,000 fatalities. Okay. And I think it's very possible that we could get higher. And the reason why I say that is because, again, the primary area we get our evidence from are the major cities. We haven't seen what's been happening in the rural areas. And we do know that in the rural areas, it's been particularly violent, where people have not had, where they feel they can get away with it. It's more difficult in the urban areas because people will film it. But for instance, there is evidence of people going out with machetes, for instance, government, and actually very, very violently clamping down on protesters.
I mean, does that level of response indicate to you that the regime is unusually spooked? Because this is not the first such outburst of widespread objection to them. We had the Green Movement after the 2009 election, gasoline price protests in 2019, the Masha Amini protests a couple of years ago. Does their reaction to this one strike you as noteworthily different?
I mean, I think so. And I would tend to agree with you on there, that I think that what you're seeing here is the overreaction, in a sense, of a very paranoid system, a system that's getting more and more paranoid about its situation, realizing that it's got fewer and fewer options ahead of it. So even after the Masha Amini protests, in which, to be fair, the level of fatalities was considerably less, but it was considerably less because they deliberately went out to maim people. I mean, this is the other thing. So we know, for instance, that they shot, shotgun pellets to blind people and stuff like that, not only killing them, so that the statistics could remain at the relatively modest 500, I think is what they said. I mean, even that's their government estimate. But this time, the level of violence, it got violent very quickly, actually. I mean, all this stuff about government restraint, I can tell you from the experience of, I've got evidence of people I know who've lost relatives and stuff, who even on the 1st of January, they were using live fire. Now, the interesting thing about all this is that normally this sort of repression only takes place after the supreme leader's given some sort of sonorous speech about how dreadful it all is and you need to all go home, otherwise, I can't be answerable to what will happen, this sort of thing. And, that's what's happened. And then they unleashed the force. This time, I mean, the supreme leader was nowhere to be seen. I mean, suddenly it all became very violent before that. So I actually feel that this is a reflection not of a system that knows, particularly how, to use violence and this, that, the other. I think this was a literally overkill. They just unleashed everything they had, and I think they panicked. And they've obviously now sought to interpret it as some sort of like domestic war. They basically said that the reason why we had to do all this is because, we were at war with these people. But that in itself is an extraordinary admission to make, actually, because you're effectively presaging some sort of like almost like a civil war in the country by saying that you're fighting. That's the justification they gave, obviously, for saying that we can kill these people because they're not actually legitimate protesters, they're fighters.
Is there any prospect, do you think, of some sort of change within the regime? Has it always been able to respond as a unified bloc? Are there any tensions between, the IRGC and the Ayatollahs, perhaps? Could somebody within the edifice think, I have to make a move in order to prop this up?
Well, there is all that. I mean, one of our problems, of course, is, and this goes back to that issue that I think you raised right at the beginning. We don't have people on the ground, really. We don't have people that can look at the real granularity of what's going on within the elite. But nonetheless, the impression we get from a distance is as something that's fairly homogenous and held together. I suspect if you zoom in, you'll begin to see a lot of disaffection within the elite about what's gone on. And, you're already seeing people who are, well-known dissidents and even those in prison and others in the country who are complaining. Mir Hussein Mousavi, the leader of the Green Movement, actually came out very recently and said, time to put down your weapons and time basically to have a referendum because this whole thing is a joke. It's turning into a farce. So I think, there'll be people even closer to the system that will realize that at some stage, this can't go on the way they are. Last summer, there was a very interesting commentary by a number of economists who were warning about the dire state of the economy. And they said, we can't carry on like this where we sort of make some adjustments to the economy and then shoot 1,000 people the minute they protest and then move on. It's just not a way of running a modern country. And of course, none of the problems that led to this latest uprising, and this was an uprising rather than a protest, by the way. I think it's much, much more severe. But none of the causes of this sort of the triggers for this uprising have been solved. In fact, they've been made considerably worse.
I mean, are there options by which the regime could maintain power other than the ones they've tried? I know you've written before that the Islamic Republic has few options that don't include its own demise, but even with some sort of cosmetic change of leadership, perhaps, if they announce that we will reform, we will liberalise somewhat, is that going to play for them at this point, or are we already past that?
I think it's too late now for this. And I think this is the problem. I mean, even Rouhani, by the way, an insider has said what we need is a big reform. Now, what he means by big reform, I don't know. But, even he's sort of saying that, look, we can't piddle around at the edges anymore. We've got to do something very serious. The trouble that the regime has, really, from my point of view, is that it faces, what I've described elsewhere as a very Soviet dilemma. So, it needs to reform to survive. But actually, the only sort of reform that is going to make it viable is actually things that ensure that as a system as it is, it will be finished. It'll have to move on to something completely different. And so, the main thrust of this is the revolution has to come to an end. I mean, Iran has to cease to be a revolutionary power and has to just be a normal power.
But just finally, on the thought of an outside enemy, is there any, because the options for the Islamic Republic that have been proposed so far either seem to be some sort of American intervention which results in the collapse of the regime and then who knows what, and or a restoration of the peacock throne and giving the Shah's son the job of running the country. Now, obviously, Pahlavi himself seems fairly keen on that, but then he would. But is there really within Iran significant appetite for either of those options?
You would be surprised, actually. I mean, I was surprised at the level of Pahlavi nostalgia and the sort of the looking towards the peacock throne or the Reza Pahlavi as their source of salvation. I mean, it has been quite striking. But I do see that really as a signal failure of the Islamic Revolution, the Islamic Republic. I mean, 46 years after the revolution, people are calling back for the Shah's son. So, I mean, in some ways, I think, Reza Pahlavi could play a role, actually, if, and this is the big if, it was done in conjunction with internal forces. But I think that the level of anger and hatred in the country now is that for the first time in my lifetime, certainly, I've seen Iranians inside the country call for Western intervention. And that's quite astonishing. I mean, that is quite astonishing. And it's not the first time, by the way, Iranian revolutionaries have called for Western intervention, by the way, or any form of intervention. It's not as unusual as people think. But the only thing I can say for certain is that people do want change.
That was Ali Ansari, Professor of Modern History and Director of the Institute for Iranian Studies at St Andrews University. This is the Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Iran has for many years sought to extend its influence across the Arab Middle East. At the peak of these foreign endeavours, Iran and/or its proxies were influential, even dominant players in 5 Arab power centres: Gaza City, Beirut, Damascus, Sana'a and Baghdad. Those capacities have been much reduced in the last couple of years, largely by Israel's response to Hamas's attack of October 7th, 2023. But how would the region respond to a complete collapse of the Iranian regime? Well, joining us now from Abu Dhabi is Dr. Anise Basiri Tabrizi, Senior Analyst at Control Risks and Associate Fellow at Chatham House. First of all, over these last few weeks and months, as the United States has raised the stakes in this showdown with Iran, how nervous would countries elsewhere in the region be getting?
Well, definitely they are watching developments very carefully. They've been watching over the past month. We have to remember that a war between Iran and Israel took place only a few months ago in June. And that one of the implications of that was that one of the U.S. bases in the Gulf country, the Qatar Al Udeid base, was targeted. So obviously, countries here in the region are watching developments, looking at what could happen next, and there are concerns, obviously, about being involved directly or indirectly in the conflict as well.
I mean, is it possible to generalize about how the Arab countries, especially in and around the Persian Gulf, would feel about the end of the Islamic Republic?
I think it's hard to generalize, but I think there are probably mixed feelings. We know that the relations between most Arab countries and Iran have been complicated, to say the least. The Gulf countries, for instance, and they had an improvement of ties over the past 3 years, really, since 2023. But up until then, relations were really sour. I think even them would not necessarily welcome, but to watch with attention what are the outcomes of a potential military attack by the United States. On one side, there is the potential benefit of seeing the Islamic Republic further weaken, and therefore the perceived threat of the Islamic Republic towards the region, particularly when it comes to its support of proxies across the region, its ballistic missile program, either gone or further weakened because of that attack. But there is also a big risk of any attack, especially large scale or moving towards a regime change scenario, also further decreasing the stability in the region with, volatility in Iran, vacuum of power, potential civil war, lack of prospect for someone coming in place of the current rulers. And therefore, I think it's something that worries also the Gulf countries. I don't think it's as straightforward as it might look like.
I mean, you mention Iran's proxies, which haven't meddled so much in those wealthy Gulf countries just across the Persian Gulf, but have meddled extensively in the Arab world further afield, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iraq in particular. I mean, how widely is that resented? Is there perhaps some feeling that Iran is overdue some sort of comeuppance?
I think it is a part of the feeling in some of these countries and within some of the leadership here. Again, it's not a generalized feeling, but definitely there is a sense that Iran has been responsible for instability, for destruction, for wars across the region for many, many years. So I think, there is a sense that now it's time for Iran to pay after so many decades of destruction across the region. But I think at the moment, we also saw the proxies significantly being weakened over the past 2 years because of the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, because of the severe weakening of these proxies, particularly because of the attacks that Israel has conducted against them, Hezbollah and Hamas, obviously, in particular. I think there is a sense that, yes, these proxies are problematic, but they have not been the problem that we have seen in the past when it comes to Iran. Obviously, if nothing is done, there is also the significant risk that these proxies can reconstruct whatever they had, because the grievances and the reason why they could mobilize and strengthen themselves over the decades are still there. So they're not gone. They're just weaker than they were. But I think there is also concern that they could become, once again, the problem that they were, say, a couple of years ago.
Is there, though, any concern, and this is probably a longer-term worry, among the Gulf countries in particular, that if the Islamic Republic was brought down and Iran became, a more sort of transparent, functional democracy, etc., might some of those smaller Gulf countries in particular feel that could be an economic threat to them?
I think we are far from that happening. Even in a deal scenario, even if down the line a normalization scenario, the relationship that most of these Gulf countries have with the West, in particular with the United States, have been so strong and so long-term that I think it's difficult to see them being undermined immediately, even in the deal scenario or normalization scenario. And for Iran to pose an economic threat to the Gulf, I think a lot has to change. I don't think we are there. And if this is a concern, then it's definitely misplaced. I think, if anything, Iran should be seen in that kind of optic as a potential opportunity, because should sanctions be lifted, the conditions be set for Iran to be able to engage economically with countries in the region, then there is 80 million people and a market that would be very well placed for Gulf countries too to engage economically. And that has been one of the reasons, by the way, why the rapprochement in 2023 was started in the first place. Obviously, from that perspective, we haven't seen any improvement or any significant change, economically speaking. But down the line, that was also the kind of goal.
I mean, just finally, and I guess trying to be somewhat optimistic, is there any hope, though, that a different Iran might lead to different relations between Iran and the Arab Middle East? Do those relations have to be adversarial?
I don't think so. I think what we have seen already in the past 3 years is that they don't have to be amicable or fully towards an alliance and strategic relation, but they can be a relationship that is based on coexistence and that is not based on a neutral threat perception. And I think obviously that could change drastically depending on what are the outcomes of the coming hours and coming days. But I think overall, the Gulf countries have assessed that it's much better to have diplomacy, engagement, if you wish, detente with Iran, whatever shape that takes, than being perceived as a threat and antagonizing the regime in Iran.
That was Dr. Anisseh Basiri Tabrizi, Senior Analyst at Control Risks and Associate Fellow at Chatham House. This is the Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio with me, Andrew Muller. The notion of removing the present regime in Iran has preoccupied US foreign policy thinkers to some degree or another since the revolution of 1979, as has the prospect that an Iran liberated from the Ayatollahs might actually be an important ally, given the country's immense and long-thwarted possibilities. One consistently hawkish voice has been that of John Bolton, former US ambassador to the United Nations under President George W. Bush and former national security advisor under President Donald Trump. John Bolton joins us now from Washington, D.C. Ambassador, first of all, from where we are right now, if the United States actually wanted to topple Iran's regime, could the United States do it?
Well, I think it's possible because I think the regime is at its weakest point since it came to power in 1979. I've thought that for some time, but now there are public reports that U.S. intelligence analysis says the same thing. I think the recent demonstrations in Iran were pretty graphic demonstrations of what the people felt, and the brutality of the regime's repression of the protest shows how panicked they are. The best way to overthrow the regime is to work with the opposition, which is extremely widespread but not well organized. I don't have any indication that Trump is doing that, but I think the regime is subject to being fragmented at the top, and it's in a very unstable condition right now, so that further pressure could cause it to come apart and collapse.
When you talk about working with the opposition in Iran, though, what would that look like in practical terms? What actual assistance could the U.S. give the Iranian opposition such as it is now?
Well, I think we want to find out what their priorities are, but everyone seems to think better communications capabilities inside Iran to beat the regime's ability to shut down the internet and telecommunications, so Starlink terminals and that sort of thing, just resources, financial assistance, given that the Iranian currency is all but collapsed, but to allow the opposition just to have the wherewithal to stay in touch and get better organized. And some are calling for supplying weapons. I think some of the opposition does have weapons already, I think in the Kurdish regions, but maybe more is required. I think the way to help the opposition is to find out where we can provide this kind of resource assistance, but also then to go after militarily instruments of state power like the IRGC, like the Basiji militia, to reduce their capability to repress the people of Iran and also to strike U.S. and friendly targets in the region. And I think this demonstration of a systematic reduction of the regime's power, as we did in part in the 12-day war with Israel, attacking ballistic missile and nuclear weapons programs, will show the regime cannot defend its critical assets and that its days are numbers. And that would become apparent to people high up in the regime, in the conventional military and elsewhere, that may induce them to defect to the opposition.
What kind of risks, though, are attached to whether direct or indirect military action, whether it is about supplying weapons to opposition or taking a direct military hand? Because don't you then raise the possibility that this allows the regime to present this external threat as a threat to all Iranians?
Well, that argument has been made in similar contexts before. People were saying for decades, you can't attack the Iranian nuclear program. It'll cause the people to rally around the regime. Well, we did attack the nuclear program, and the people went out in the streets a few months later saying death to the Ayatollahs, not death to America. I think the people can see that what the U.S. is concerned about is the regime. It's not the people of Iran. It's the threat that the regime poses to its near neighbors and really around the world, and obviously now to its own people.
But if it was possible, and if these actions did result in the toppling of the Iranian regime and, I guess, an end to the Islamic Republic of Iran as we've known it, should the United States at that point be content to let the Iranian people figure out what's next for themselves?
I think that would be the most desirable outcome. Look, this regime has been in power 46 years, and it's caused a lot of misery in Iran, and I'm sure there are scores to be settled. I'm not naive enough to think this is going to happen without some turmoil and some bloodshed. But the alternative, which is to let the regime stay in power, is unacceptable. I think it's unacceptable for U.S. security reasons, and my guess is unacceptable to about 80 to 90% of the Iranian population. So it really is up to them. They went out into the streets in great numbers, and for their troubles were massacred. That didn't draw them any closer to the regime, that's for sure.
I mean, are there potentially lessons that could or perhaps are being learned here from previous American interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan where the regimes were toppled, but that was then followed by an attempt by the United States and its allies to establish some new model polity on the ground? Is the thinking now that perhaps it is just better to make a direct assault on the head of the regime or on the top of the regime and then let the pieces fall where they will?
Well, I think here it's got to be more than just the very top of the regime. Iran today is effectively run by the Revolutionary Guard. They control the nuclear and ballistic missile programs. They control, by many estimates, 40% of the economy. So getting rid of the Ayatollahs is really getting rid more of the camouflage than anything else. That's why hitting IRGC targets to reduce their capabilities, to reduce the state's capabilities, is so important. I do think it was a mistake for the U.S. to try and nation build. My view back in Iraq was give them a copy of the Federalist Papers and say, good luck. We're not good at nation building. Frankly, our problem in Afghanistan was not that we tried to help them rebuild the country. It's that we left. And if we hadn't left, I think things would be very different. I certainly don't think the Taliban would be back in power.
I mean, are you seeing, though, especially in this first year of President Trump's second term, more of, I guess, a fondness for what we might think of as the short, sharp shock, such as we saw most obviously in Venezuela, but also in those missile strikes against Islamist militias in Nigeria?
Well, I think that is a Trump tendency, and I think it's a mistake. In the case of Iran, the opposition should have been working to find leaders in the conventional military, maybe even the Revolutionary Guard, maybe even among the Ayatollahs, who are prepared at the right time to come over to their side. I do think there's a serious question how much of the rank and file, even of the Revolutionary Guard, would be prepared to go after their own people if they thought the regime itself was in trouble. And that's why a strategic view here, a sustained view of how to go after the regime is necessary. I think Trump will use military force because he drew a red line for the regime. They crossed it and he didn't do anything. So if he's going to vindicate himself and avoid looking like Obama, which is sort of ingrained in him, I think there will be military action. But if it's one and done, it may harm the regime, but it will not be sufficient to bring it down.
But in your view, should the United States be, whether obviously probably not publicly, but privately declaring to itself limits on the extent of any military action? Because there can't imaginably be any appetite, for example, for sending ground forces into Iran.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question of boots on the ground here. Whether it's a good idea or not, Trump's not going to do it. So there's really no point dwelling on it one way or the other. But I do think he appreciates that that the regime remains committed to getting nuclear weapons, and notwithstanding his overstated claims of the effect of our raid, we did do significant damage to the program, but we did not finish it off. And as long as that threat is out there, you're not going to have peace and stability in the Middle East while this regime is in power.
How mindful, though, is that, and again, drawing on your experience of how these discussions might have gone in previous times, how mindful is the United States going to be about the nervousness of its allies closer to Iran about how this might pan out? Because obviously countries like Qatar, Oman, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, they're probably going to be a bit nervous about this.
Sure. Well, look, I think one thing they're nervous about is that Iran would retaliate by attacking their oil infrastructure. So they have said over the years, many different ways, don't attack Iran's oil infrastructure. And I buy the logic to that. I think the Iranian regime could well, if we went after the facilities on Karg Island, for example, it would seem logical to the regime in Tehran to retaliate by taking out the Gulf Arab oil infrastructure, in effect saying, well, if we can't export oil, neither are you. So I would leave the oil infrastructure of Iran alone, at least at the beginning. And I think that really does minimize the danger to the Gulf Arabs. I think we should certainly do everything we can to provide additional protection in the event Trump takes a decision to use military force to help protect them from possible retaliation. That's one reason why going after the Iranian missile capabilities and after Revolutionary Guard air bases makes a lot of sense.
I mean, just finally, they are, as we are talking on Friday afternoon London time, speaking to the United States in Oman. The latest news appears to be that Iran is suggesting these talks are positive. Iran was obviously keen that these talks be confined to their nuclear program and their extremely ambiguous ambitions for it. They may be looking for an off-ramp. In fact, they almost certainly are, given the alternative. But do you really think that the United States shouldn't offer them one?
No, I think these talks are a waste of oxygen. I mean, they will say anything, including, as you've just mentioned, how wonderful the talks are going. Let's continue them next week in Oman. I mean, that buys them another 7 days. I've been down this road before. I just don't think we need to go down it again.
John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador to the UN and National Security Advisor, thank you for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.